The bank app refreshed at exactly 2:17 a.m., and the number I had spent 6 years building dropped to zero in less than a second. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old, and 3 nights ago, every dollar I had saved, $140,000, was gone, not transferred, not pending, not frozen, just gone like it had never existed in the first place. And the worst part wasn't the number disappearing, it was what the bank told me 5 minutes later when I called in shaking, barefoot on my kitchen floor, staring at my phone like it might fix itself if I waited long enough. They said the withdrawals were authorized. They said whoever took the money had full legal access to the account. They said there was nothing they could do, and I remember asking the same question 3 times because it didn't make sense. Authorized by who? Authorized how? And that's when the representative paused just long enough for me to feel it before she said it out loud. It was signed by someone on your household access list. And in that moment I didn't feel angry yet. I didn't even feel scared. I just felt this strange, hollow quiet, like my brain was refusing to connect the dots sitting right in front of me because there were only 3 people on that list, and 2 of them had raised me, and I had spent my entire life believing that meant something. 6 years of double shifts, 6 years of skipped vacations, 6 years of saying no to things people my age said yes to without thinking. I worked mornings at a dental office, nights doing freelance bookkeeping, weekends picking up anything that paid in cash. I tracked every dollar in a spreadsheet down to the cent. I remember celebrating when I hit 10,000, then 50, then finally 100,000, like it was proof that I could build something on my own even if no one in my family ever saw me as worth investing in. Because in my house growing up, there was always a difference, not the loud kind, not the kind people outside would notice, but the quiet kind that settles into everything. My younger sister Lily got a brand new SUV the week she turned 16 with a red ribbon on top. I got a used laptop with a cracked hinge and a reminder to be grateful. Lily studied abroad in Barcelona for a summer, fully paid. I stayed home and worked overtime to cover my own community college tuition before transferring. Every time I brought up my plans, my goals, my savings, my father would nod like he was humoring me, like I was playing at something temporary, and my mother would say the same line she'd been using for years. It's good you're independent, Emily. Not everyone is meant for big things. And I told myself, it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need their approval as long as I had control over my own life, over my own money, over something that was finally mine. And maybe that was my first mistake because I trusted the system I thought was safe. I left the account linked under the same family structure we'd had since I was a teenager. I never thought to remove them, never thought I needed to, because who prepares for something like that from their own parents? And even after the call, even after hearing the words authorized access, I still gave them the benefit of the doubt. I told myself there had to be a misunderstanding, a mistake, maybe a transfer I didn't recognize, maybe something temporary. So I got in my car at 3 in the morning and drove straight to the only place that made sense, the house I grew up in, the house where I had spent years trying to prove I wasn't invisible. And I remember sitting in the driveway with the engine still running, staring at the porch light, telling myself this was going to be simple, that I was going to walk in, ask one question, and get an answer that made everything make sense again. But I didn't realize then that some answers don't fix anything, they just show you exactly where you stand, and that night was the moment everything started to change. I did not knock right away. I sat there with my hand still on the steering wheel, watching the porch light flicker slightly like it always had, the same warm yellow glow that used to mean home, and I remember thinking how strange it felt that something so familiar could suddenly feel like a place I did not belong anymore. But eventually I turned off the engine, stepped out into the cold night air, and walked up to the front door. Each step heavier than it should have been, like my body already knew what my mind was still trying to deny. And when I rang the bell, it only took a few seconds before my father opened the door, fully awake, fully dressed, like he had been expecting something or someone. And for a moment we just stood there looking at each other, no surprise on his face, no confusion, just that same controlled expression he always had when he was about to explain something in a way that made you feel small for asking. And before I could even say anything, he stepped aside and said, "You should come in, Emily." Like this was a normal conversation we had planned, like I was not standing there at 3:30 in the morning because everything I owned had just disappeared. And I walked into the house slowly, noticing how nothing had changed, the same furniture, the same photos on the wall, Lily smiling in the center of every frame, me somewhere off to the side, sometimes half cropped out, and my mother was already sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of tea in front of her, her hands wrapped around it like she needed something to hold on to. And that was the moment my chest tightened, because people do not sit calmly like that unless they already know why you are there. And I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse anyone, I just said it plainly. My savings are gone. And the silence that followed was not confusion, it was not shock, it was something heavier, something settled, like the truth had been sitting in that room long before I walked in. And my father pulled out a chair and sat down across from me, folding his hands like he was about to present a case, and he said, "We were going to talk to you about it." And that sentence, those simple words, that was when something inside me finally cracked, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet realization that there was no misunderstanding, no mistake. This had been a decision, and I asked the question I had been holding since the bank call, "Did you take it?" And he did not hesitate, he did not deny it, he just nodded once and said, "We used it." Like the difference in wording made it better, like taking and using were somehow not the same thing when it was $140,000 that I had earned one shift at a time. And I remember looking at my mother then, waiting for something, an apology, an explanation, anything that sounded like regret, but she just looked down into her cup and said softly, "It was necessary." And I felt that hollow quiet again spreading through me, because necessary for who, for what? And that was when my father continued, calm and steady, "This family had obligations, Emily, and you are part of this family." And I almost laughed because it was the first time in years I had heard him include me in that sentence, and it was only happening now when it benefited them. And I asked where the money went, and he answered like it was obvious, like I should have already known. Lily needed help with her condo. The down payment was time sensitive. And there it was, laid out in front of me in the simplest terms possible. 6 years of my life turned into someone else's starting point. And I looked over at the counter where Lily's keys were sitting, a brand new set, shiny and untouched. And I realized this was not an emergency, this was not survival, this was a choice. And when I said, "That was my money," my father leaned back slightly and gave me a look I had seen my entire life, the one that dismissed everything I felt before I could even finish saying it. And he replied, "You live under this roof, everything here is shared." And that was not even true anymore. I had moved out 2 years ago, built my own place, paid my own bills, but in his mind that did not matter, because in his mind I was still something that belonged to him, something he could access when needed. And my mother finally looked up then and added, "You would have helped if we asked." And that sentence hit harder than anything else, because it was true. I would have helped, I would have given them something, maybe not everything, but something, if they had just treated me like I had a choice, like I had value beyond what they could take. And I sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything settle into place, the years of small moments, the quiet dismissals, the constant comparisons, all leading to this one decision they made without me. And that was when I did something they did not expect. I nodded slowly, stood up and said, "Okay." Just one word, calm, controlled, no argument, no scene. And I saw the brief flicker of relief in my father's eyes, like he thought this was over, like he thought I had accepted it. But what they did not realize was that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is the beginning of something else. And I did not realize then just how far this was going to go. I did not drive home right away after I left their house. I just sat in my car at the end of the street with the engine running, watching the rearview mirror like something might follow me, like the version of me that walked into that house thinking this could still be fixed was still somewhere behind me. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt very clear, not emotional, not chaotic, just clear, because there was no more guessing, no more hoping they would explain it in a way that made sense. They had already told me exactly what they believed, that what was mine was theirs if they decided it was. And I realized something sitting there in the dark, something I think I had known for years but never said out loud. I was never going to be seen as separate from them, not really, not in a way that meant I had control over my own life, my own work, my own money. And the strange part was, once I accepted that, I stopped feeling the need to argue. I stopped feeling the urge to convince them they were wrong, because you cannot negotiate with someone who does not believe you have a right to say no. So instead of driving home, I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app again, scrolling through the transaction history slowly this time, not in panic but in focus. And that is when I noticed something I had missed before. The withdrawals were not random, they were structured, timed, almost methodical. 3 separate transactions over 48 hours, each one just under the threshold that would automatically trigger a fraud alert. And that detail mattered because it meant this was not impulsive, it was planned. And I felt that quiet shift inside me again, the one that replaces hurt with something colder, something more precise. And I remembered a conversation I had months ago with my bank advisor when I first crossed 100,000. She had explained how joint access worked, how authorization could be shared, but also how it could be traced, documented, verified. And at the time I had not paid much attention, because why would I? But now every word of that conversation came back like it had been waiting for this exact moment. And without thinking too much about it, I drove straight to the 24-hour branch downtown. The one with the glass doors and the quiet lobby that always smelled faintly like coffee and printer ink. And when I walked in, the night manager looked up with that polite, neutral expression people use when they do not know if something is routine or urgent, and I told him I needed a full transaction report, every detail, every signature, every authorization linked to my account, and maybe it was the way I said it or maybe it was the time of night, but he did not question me, he just nodded and disappeared into the back office, and while I waited I sat there under the fluorescent lights staring at the reflection of myself in the glass, thinking about how easy it would have been to walk away, to accept what they said, to tell myself it was not worth the fight because that is what I had always done in smaller ways. I had stayed quiet, I had adjusted, I had made myself easier to overlook, but this was different, not just because of the money, but because of what it represented, years of proving to myself that I could build something stable, something independent, something that was mine without permission, and I realized I was not just deciding what to do about the money, I was deciding what to do about everything that came before it. And when the manager came back, he handed me a printed packet, thick, detailed, official, and he pointed to a section near the top, where the authorization signatures were listed, and I followed his finger, reading the name slowly, and there it was, exactly what I already knew but needed to see in writing, my father's name, Richard Carter, attached to every single withdrawal with timestamps, branch locations, and verification codes, all perfectly legitimate on paper. And for a moment I just stared at it, not shocked, not surprised, just certain, because proof does something that words cannot. It removes the last piece of doubt, and as I closed the folder I thanked the manager, stood up, and walked out into the early morning air. And that was when I made the decision, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of something much simpler. I was not going to let this disappear quietly. I was not going to let them define this as normal. And I did not realize then how quickly that decision would start to move things in a direction none of them were prepared for. By the time the sun started to come up, I had not slept, I had not even gone home. I was sitting in my car outside my apartment building with that folder on the passenger seat, staring at it like it was something fragile, something that could still disappear if I looked away for too long, and I kept thinking about how easy it would be to close it, to put it in the glove compartment, to tell myself I would deal with it later, because later always feels safer than now. But I knew if I delayed even a little, I would start rationalizing it, I would start minimizing it the way I always had with everything else they had done, and I could already hear the voice in my head trying to soften it, telling me it was just money, that families do complicated things, that maybe they would pay it back eventually. But then I looked at the timestamps again, the careful spacing of each withdrawal, the precision of it, and I realized this was not something that just happened, this was something that had been decided, planned, executed, and justified before I ever knew it was happening. And that clarity made the next step feel less like a choice and more like a line I had already crossed, so instead of going upstairs, I started the engine again and drove to the only place that was open that early and could actually do something with what I had, the police station downtown, the one with the gray brick exterior and the flag that never seemed to move no matter how strong the wind was. And I remember parking across the street for a full minute before going in, not because I was afraid of what would happen, but because I understood what it meant once I walked through those doors. This was no longer just a family issue. It was something official, something documented, something that could not be undone with a conversation at a kitchen table. And when I finally stepped inside, the air was cool and quiet, the front desk lit by a single overhead light, and the officer on duty looked up with the same neutral expression I had seen at the bank, waiting to see what kind of situation this was going to be. And I told him I needed to report unauthorized withdrawals from my account. And even as I said the words, I felt how strange they sounded, how detached they were from the reality of it, because technically it was authorized, technically it followed every rule on paper, and that was what made it worse because it meant I had to explain not just what happened but why it was wrong. And I handed him the folder, open to the page with my father's name repeated 3 times, each one tied to a transaction that erased years of my life, and he read it carefully, slower than I expected, like he understood that rushing through it would miss something important. And then he asked the question I knew was coming. Did you give him permission to use the funds? And for a second I hesitated, not because I was unsure but because I knew how complicated the answer was, and I said, no, I did not. And then I added, not like that, because there is a difference between access and consent, and I could see him processing that, weighing it against whatever guidelines he had in his head, and he nodded slightly, then asked for more details, how the account was set up, when I last accessed it, whether there had been any prior discussions about the money, and I answered everything as clearly as I could, keeping my voice steady, keeping the emotion out of it, because this was not about how I felt anymore, it was about what could be proven. And after a few minutes, he stepped away to speak with someone in the back, leaving me alone at the counter with the sound of a printer running somewhere behind the wall, and I stood there watching the reflection of the station lights in the glass door, thinking about my father sitting at that kitchen table, so certain he had done nothing wrong, so certain I would accept it the way I always had. And I realized something in That moment that felt almost surreal. He had never considered this possibility, not even for a second, because in his mind, there was no version of this story where I did something he did not approve of. And that was exactly why I had to keep going, because this was not just about getting the money back, it was about redefining what was acceptable, what was allowed, what I was willing to tolerate. And when the officer came back, his tone had shifted slightly, more formal now, more deliberate. And he said, "We are going to need to open a report and gather additional information." And I nodded, because I already knew there was no turning back. And as he began asking for my full name, my address, my contact details, I felt that same quiet clarity settle in again. The kind that comes when something irreversible has already begun, and I did not realize then just how quickly that report would move beyond that room, and into places my parents never expected. The report took less than 20 minutes to start and somehow felt like it changed everything the moment my name was typed into their system, not because anything had been resolved yet, but because it was no longer just my word against theirs. It was documented, time-stamped, recorded in a way that could not be rewritten later, and as the officer handed me a copy of the case number, he explained the next steps in a calm, procedural tone. They would review the account structure, verify the authorization limits, contact the financial institution directly, and if necessary reach out to the individuals involved for statements. And when he said that last part, something in my chest tightened just slightly, not fear exactly, but anticipation, because I knew what that meant. This was going to reach my parents sooner than they expected. And for the first time since all of this started, I allowed myself to think about what that moment would look like on their side. My father answering a call he did not recognize, hearing a voice that did not belong to him, asking questions he could not control, and I wondered if he would still sound as certain as he had at the kitchen table, or if there would be a pause, even a small one, where he realized this was not something he could dismiss with a sentence. And when I walked back outside, the morning air felt different, not lighter, not better, just different, like the ground under everything had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And I drove home slowly this time, watching the streets fill with people starting their day, coffee in hand, routines intact, completely unaware that mine had just been broken and rebuilt in the span of a few hours. And when I finally got to my apartment, I did not go straight to bed. I placed the folder on my kitchen counter, sat down across from it, and just looked at it again, because now it was more than proof. It was the beginning of something I had never done before, something I had always avoided, and that was holding them accountable in a way that did not rely on their agreement. And around 10:30 that morning my phone rang, the screen lighting up with my father's name, and I stared at it for a few seconds before answering, already knowing the tone he was going to use, already knowing this was not going to be a conversation about understanding. And the moment I picked up, his voice came through sharper than before, controlled but edged with something new. Something that had not been there the night before. "Emily, what did you do?" And it was not a question, not really, it was an accusation wrapped in confusion, and I kept my voice steady when I responded. "I reported the withdrawals." And there was a pause on the line, longer this time, noticeable, and when he spoke again, the certainty was still there, but it was thinner, like it had been stretched. "You had no right to do that." And I almost said something back immediately, something emotional, something that matched the weight of everything he had taken, but instead I chose the simplest truth I had. It was my account. And that was when his tone shifted again, not louder, not angry, but more deliberate, more careful, like he was recalibrating in real time. "Emily, you are making this into something it is not. We already discussed why the money was used. This is unnecessary." And I realized then that in his mind, the conversation we had in the kitchen had settled it, that my silence had been interpreted exactly the way he wanted it to be, as acceptance, as compliance, and I could hear my mother's voice faintly in the background, asking what was happening, and he covered the phone slightly, his words muffled but urgent, and for a brief second, I pictured them standing in that same kitchen, the same table, the same place where they had explained everything so calmly just hours earlier. Except now there was something different in the air, something they could not control, and when he came back on the line, his voice was firmer, more direct. "You need to fix this, call them back, explain that it was a misunderstanding." And I shook my head even though he could not see me, because that was the moment everything became completely clear, not just what had happened, but what was expected of me, to erase it, to undo it, to restore things to the version of reality where their actions did not have consequences. And I said quietly, "It was not a misunderstanding." And the silence that followed was heavier than anything else he had said, because this time, there was no immediate response, no quick correction, just the space where something unspoken had finally surfaced. And I did not realize then how much that single sentence was about to change the direction of everything that came next. He did not argue immediately after that, and that was new because my father had always had a response ready, always had a way to reframe things so that he was right and I was simply misunderstanding, but this time there was a pause that lasted just a second too long, and when he finally spoke again his voice had changed in a way I had never heard before. It was still controlled, still measured, but there was something underneath it now, something uncertain. "Emily, you are overreacting," he said, but it did not land the way it used to. It did not settle anything, it just hung there. And I realized that for the first time he was not speaking from a place of complete certainty. He was adjusting, trying to find the version of this conversation that would pull me back into the role he understood. And when I did not respond right away, he continued, more insistent now. "This is a family matter, it should stay a family matter." And that phrase, that exact phrase, it had been used so many times before, always when something needed to be kept quiet, always when accountability would have been inconvenient. And I could hear my mother again in the background, her voice more urgent now, asking what was happening, and then Lily's voice too, softer, confused, like she had just been pulled into something. She did not fully understand, and that detail mattered more than anything my father was saying because it meant they were all hearing it at the same time. They were all realizing together that this was not contained anymore. And I said the only thing that felt true in that moment. It stopped being just a family matter when you took it without asking. And there was another pause, sharper this time, like the words had landed somewhere he could not immediately redirect. And when he spoke again, the control was still there, but now it was tighter, more deliberate. "We did ask, Emily, you just did not understand the situation." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, the shift from action to interpretation, from what happened to how it should be seen. And I realized that this was not going to change, not through explanation, not through logic, not through anything that depended on them agreeing with me. And that realization made the next part easier because I did not need them to agree anymore. I just needed to continue, and I said, "The report is already filed." And I let the sentence sit there without adding anything else because there was nothing else to add, and this time the silence that followed was different. It was heavier, longer, filled with something that had not been there before. And when my father spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter. "You are making a mistake," he said, and I could hear something behind it now, not just frustration but concern, the kind that appears when control starts to slip. And I wondered if he was thinking about the same details I had seen in that report, the timestamps, the signatures, the structure of the withdrawals, or if he was just realizing that this was moving outside of his reach. And I thought about answering him, about explaining everything I had already understood, but I stopped myself because explanation had never changed anything before, and it was not going to start now, so instead I said, "I have to go." And I ended the call before he could respond, and for a moment, I just sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the phone still in my hand, the weight of what I had just done settling in slowly, not as fear, not as regret, but as something more solid, more grounded, like I had finally stepped into a version of myself that did not need permission to act. And a few minutes later my phone buzzed again, this time a message from my mother, shorter, more direct. "Call us, we can fix this." And I read it twice before setting the phone down on the counter because that word, fix, carried everything in it. Not fix what they had done, not fix the situation itself, but fix the exposure, fix the consequences, fix the part where this had left the boundaries they were comfortable with. And I realized then that this was the first real difference between us. I was trying to address what happened, and they were trying to contain what it meant. And around noon my phone rang again, but this time it was not a name I recognized, just a number, and when I answered, a calm, professional voice introduced himself, stating his name, his department, and the reason for the call. And as he spoke, referencing the report, confirming details, explaining next steps, I felt that same quiet clarity return, because this was it, this was the part that could not be undone with a conversation or a message. And I did not realize then just how quickly that call had already reached the other side, or how unprepared they were for what was coming next. The man on the phone spoke in a calm, steady tone, the kind that does not rush and does not react, and he asked me to confirm a few details again: my full name, the last 4 digits of my account, the date I first noticed the withdrawals, and as I answered, I could hear the faint sound of typing on the other end, each keystroke marking something official, something that would not disappear later. And when he finished, he paused briefly before explaining that they had already initiated contact with the financial institution, and that outreach to the listed authorized user would follow shortly if it had not already occurred. And that phrase stayed with me, if it had not already occurred, because it meant this was moving faster than I expected, faster than my parents expected. And I thanked him, kept my voice level, and ended the call. And for a moment I just stood there in my kitchen, staring at nothing in particular, letting the reality of it settle in, because this was no longer Just about a report sitting in a system somewhere. It was active now, moving, reaching outward, and I knew exactly where it was headed next. And it did not take long to confirm that, because less than 20 minutes later my phone lit up again, this time with Lily's name. And that alone told me everything I needed to know, because Lily never called me during the day, not unless something directly affected her, and when I answered, her voice came through fast, confused, a little breathless. "Emily, what is going on? Why are people asking about the account?" And there it was, the shift I had been expecting, not from my father this time but from her, because she had always been slightly removed from the consequences, always just close enough to benefit but not close enough to be questioned. And I asked her what she had been told, and she hesitated for a second before saying, "Dad said there is some kind of issue, that you made a report or something. I do not understand why this is happening." And I could hear something genuine in her voice, not guilt exactly but confusion, like she had not been part of the decision in the same way, like she had accepted the outcome without ever asking how it happened. And I realized then that this was the first time she was being pulled into it, not as the one receiving something, but as someone connected to the situation itself. And I said, "Because the money was taken without my consent." And I kept it simple, because there was no point layering it with history, with context, with years of small details she had never noticed or chosen not to notice. And she was quiet for a moment before responding. "But Dad said it was for the condo, that it was temporary." And I almost repeated what my father had said the night before, but I stopped because it did not matter what he said, it mattered what actually happened, and I asked her a different question instead. "Did you know where the money came from?" And there was a longer pause this time, long enough that I could hear her breathing on the other end, and when she answered it was softer, less certain. I assumed it was from savings, from the family. And that word again, family, used in the same way it always had been, broad, undefined, convenient. And I said, "It was my savings." And I let the sentence sit there without adding anything else, and I could feel the shift happen on her side of the call, not dramatic, not immediate, but subtle, like something was rearranging itself in her understanding. And she said quietly, "I did not know that." And for the first time in this entire situation I believed what someone was saying, because her voice did not carry the same certainty, the same control. It carried uncertainty, and maybe even the beginning of realization. And she followed it with another question, more hesitant now, "What happens now?" And I thought about that for a second, about all the steps already in motion, the report, the documentation, the calls that were no longer in my control. And I answered honestly, "They are reviewing everything." And I could hear her exhale slowly, like she was trying to process something she had not expected to face. And in the background I could hear my parents' voices again, lower this time, more urgent, overlapping in a way that felt unfamiliar. And I realized that whatever conversation was happening in that house right now, it was not the same controlled discussion from the night before. It was something else, something less certain. And before hanging up, Lily said one more thing, quieter than anything else she had said. "Emily, I think Dad did not think you would do this." And I did not respond right away, because that sentence captured everything, not just about this situation, but about every moment that led up to it, the assumption that I would stay quiet, that I would accept it, that I would not act in a way that disrupted their version of reality. And I finally said, "He should have asked." And after the call ended I stood there in the silence again, feeling that same steady clarity settle in, because this was no longer about what they expected from me, it was about what was already in motion. And I did not realize then that the next step would not come from me at all, but from someone knocking on a door that was not mine. It happened faster than I expected, not hours later, not the next day, but that same afternoon. And I only knew because my phone started vibrating again, this time not with a call, not with a message, but with a short voicemail notification from an unknown number. And when I played it, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, and very specific. "This message is for Richard Carter. Please contact us regarding an active financial inquiry." And even though the message was not meant for me, it told me everything I needed to know. They had reached him, they had not waited, they had not delayed, and whatever conversation he thought he could control was already happening without him setting the terms. And I stood there in my kitchen holding my phone, replaying the message once, then again, not because I needed to hear it, but because I needed to feel what it meant. This was real now in a way it had not been before. Not just on paper, not just in a report, but in his world, in his space. And about 10 minutes later my phone rang again, and this time I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. The tone alone told me, sharper, faster, more urgent. And when I answered, my father did not ease into the conversation this time. He went straight to the point. "You need to stop this." And there was no question in his voice, no attempt to explain, just a direct command. And I could hear something else behind it now, something that had not been there before, something closer to pressure, and I stayed quiet for a second before asking, "Stop." What? Even though I already knew the answer because I wanted him to say it, I wanted him to define it in his own words, and he responded immediately, "The inquiry, the calls, whatever you started, you need to end it now." And that phrasing mattered because it showed exactly how he saw this, not as a consequence of what he had done, but as something I had created, something unnecessary, something disruptive, and I leaned against the counter, keeping my voice steady as I said, "I did not start anything." I reported what happened, and there was a brief pause, shorter this time, like he was not interested in debating definitions anymore, and when he spoke again his tone shifted, not softer but more calculated. "Emily, listen to me carefully, this can get complicated very quickly, there are legal implications you do not understand." And I almost smiled at that because for the first time, he was acknowledging something beyond his control, even if he was framing it as something I did not understand, and I replied, "I understand enough." And that was when I heard my mother's voice clearly in the background, not muffled this time but direct. "Tell her to call them back, tell her to fix it before it escalates." And the word escalates hung in the air for a second, because it confirmed what I already knew. This was moving beyond their comfort zone, beyond their ability to contain it, and my father lowered his voice slightly, like he was trying to regain control of the conversation. "We can resolve this internally, there is no need for outside involvement." And that sentence felt almost identical to something he had said earlier, just reworded, just adjusted to fit the situation as it changed, and I realized that no matter how this progressed, his approach would stay the same: redirect, minimize, contain. And I said, "You already made it an outside issue." And there was a sharper pause this time, one that lasted just long enough to feel like a shift, and when he responded his voice was different again, not louder, not angrier, but more urgent, more real. "Emily, this affects more than just you." And I thought about that for a moment, about what he meant: the condo, the transactions, the paper trail, the people now asking questions, and I realized that for the first time the impact was spreading in a direction he could not fully predict, and I answered simply, "It always did." And that was when the conversation broke in a way it had not before, not into shouting, not into chaos, but into something quieter, more unstable, and he did not respond right away, and in that silence, I could hear movement on his side, voices shifting, something being discussed. Quickly out of range of the phone, and then he came back on the line, his tone controlled again but thinner, like it was being held together with effort. "We will talk about this tonight," he said, and it sounded less like a request and more like an attempt to reestablish a structure he understood, a setting where he could manage the narrative again. And I said, "There is nothing to talk about." And before he could respond, I ended the call, because I already knew what that conversation would be, how it would go, what would be said, and it would not change anything that had already started. And as I set my phone down, I looked out the window at the street below, people moving through their day, cars passing, everything normal, everything steady, and I realized how different my reality had become in just a few hours, how something that had been hidden inside one account, one decision, was now unfolding across multiple places at once, and I did not realize then that while I was standing there watching everything move forward from a distance, something else had already happened at a door I was not standing in front of, and that moment was about to change everything in a way none of us had prepared for. The knock did not come to my door, it came to theirs, sometime late that afternoon while I was sitting in my apartment with my phone face down on the counter, trying to keep some distance from everything that had already started moving without me, and I only knew about it because Lily called again, this time not confused, not uncertain, but shaken in a way I had never heard before, her voice quieter, slower, like she was choosing each word carefully. "Emily, someone came by the house." And I did not interrupt her, I did not ask who because I already knew, and she continued, "They said they needed to speak with Dad about the account." And there was a pause after that, longer than any she had taken before, like she was still trying to process what she had just witnessed, and I could picture it clearly without being there, the door opening, my father standing there expecting a package or a neighbor, and instead finding someone asking questions he could not redirect, could not dismiss, could not reframe into something harmless. And I asked her what happened next, and she hesitated again before answering. They asked him to confirm some information about the withdrawals, about the account access, and they mentioned your name. And I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting that settle in, because this was the moment everything crossed from private to undeniable. And she added quietly, "Mom was there too," and she kept trying to explain, but they did not really respond, they just kept asking questions. And that detail mattered more than anything else, she said, because it meant the usual pattern was not working, the explanations, the tone, the confidence, none of it was changing the direction of the conversation. And I could hear movement in the background again, voices lower now, less controlled, more fragmented, and Lily said something that stayed with me longer than anything else. I have never seen Dad like that before. And I knew exactly what she meant without her needing to explain it, because my father had always been the one in control of every room he walked into, every conversation, every outcome, and the idea that he was now in a position where he had to respond instead of direct, where he had to answer instead of define, that was not something he was used to. And I asked her one more question, simple, direct. Did he say anything after? And she exhaled slowly before answering. He said it was a misunderstanding, that it would be cleared up. And I almost nodded to myself because that was exactly what I expected, the same pattern, just applied to a new situation. And I realized then that even now, even with everything happening in real time, he was still trying to shape the narrative into something manageable, something temporary, something that could be resolved without consequences. And Lily added softer now, Emily, is this serious? And that question carried something different, not just confusion but concern, maybe even the beginning of awareness. And I answered honestly, yes, because there was no reason to soften it, no reason to protect anyone from what was already happening. And she was quiet for a moment before saying, I did not think it would go this far. And I almost responded immediately, but I stopped because that sentence captured the entire situation in a way nothing else had. The assumption that there was a limit, that there was a line this would not cross. And I said, neither did they. And after we hung up, I sat there for a long moment, letting the silence settle in again. But it felt different now, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something that had finally taken shape, something that was no longer just building but actively unfolding. And I thought about the timeline, the calls, the report, the visit, how quickly it had all moved from one step to the next. And I realized that whatever came next was not going to slow down, not because I was pushing it, but because it had already reached a point where it could not be contained. And I looked over at the folder still sitting on the counter, the printed pages that had started all of this, and I understood something very clearly in that moment. This was no longer about proving anything. It was about letting the process continue. And I did not realize then that the next step would not be a phone call or a message, but something that would bring everything back to the same place it started, except this time, nothing would be explained the way it had been before. By early evening, everything had already shifted into something I could no longer control, not in the sense of stopping it, but in the sense of predicting how it would unfold next. And when my phone rang again just after 6, I saw my mother's name this time, not my father's, not Lily's, and that alone told me this was different, because my mother rarely called me directly when something serious was happening. She usually stayed in the background, reinforcing whatever version of events my father presented, but now she was the one reaching out. And when I answered, her voice was softer than usual, almost careful. Emily, can we talk? And I leaned back against the counter, already knowing this was not a conversation about understanding, but about control, about trying to bring things back into a space they recognized. And I said, we already did, keeping my tone even. And there was a small pause before she continued. Not like this, not with everything that is happening now. And I could hear the difference in her voice, not fear exactly, but discomfort, like the situation had moved beyond something she could manage quietly. And she went on, they came to the house, they asked a lot of questions, your father is trying to sort it out, but this is getting complicated. And that word again, complicated, used the same way my father had used it earlier, like complexity itself was the problem, not what had caused it. And I asked her one simple question. Did he tell them what happened? And she hesitated just for a second before answering. He explained the situation. And I almost nodded to myself because that was exactly what I expected, an explanation, not an admission, a version of events shaped to sound reasonable. And she added quickly, Emily, they said there might be further steps, more follow-up. This is not something that just goes away. And I let that settle for a moment because hearing it from her, hearing that acknowledgement that this was continuing, that it was not stopping with one visit or one conversation that mattered more than anything else she had said. And she continued, her voice quieter now. We can still fix this, you can call them, clarify that it was authorized, that there was a misunderstanding. And there it was again, the same request, the same expectation, just coming from a different voice. And I realized something in that moment. It did not matter which one of them I was speaking to. The goal was always the same, restore the version of reality where their actions did not have consequences. And I said, it was not authorized the way you are saying it was. And I kept it simple because anything more would just open the door to another explanation, another attempt to reshape it. And she sighed softly on the other end, the kind of sigh that suggests patience, like she believed I just needed to understand things from their perspective. Emily, you have to see this from our side. We did what we thought was necessary. Lily needed that opportunity, the timing mattered. And I closed my eyes for a second because that sentence was not new. It was just more direct now, more open, and I said, "That does not make it okay." And there was a longer pause this time, one that stretched just enough to feel like something was shifting. And when she spoke again, her voice was different, not softer, not calmer, but more honest in a way I had not heard before. "Your father did not think it would turn into this." And I almost smiled at that because it echoed exactly what Lily had said earlier, the same assumption, the same expectation, and I replied, "That does not change what happened." And she did not respond immediately, and in that silence, I could hear the faint sounds of the house in the background, footsteps, a door closing, voices moving from one room to another, and I realized that whatever conversation was happening there now, it was not the same controlled discussion from before. It was something fractured, something uncertain, and she finally said, "He is trying to handle it, but this could affect more than just the money." And I thought about that for a moment, about the account, the transactions, the documentation, everything now being reviewed by people outside of our family, and I understood what she meant. This was not just about one decision anymore, it was about everything connected to it, and I said, "It already does." And that was when the conversation reached a point where there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to reframe, just two versions of reality that were not going to meet. And after a few seconds she said quietly, "We will talk again soon," and I knew that was not a suggestion, it was an attempt to keep a line open, to maintain some level of connection in a situation that was moving beyond them, and I said, "Maybe." Before ending the call, and as I set my phone down, I looked around my apartment at the quiet, the stillness, the space that I had built for myself over the years, and I realized how separate it felt now from everything that was happening at their house, how different the two spaces had become. And I did not realize then that the next time we would all be in the same place again, it would not be for a conversation, and nothing would be explained the way it had been before. The next morning did not start with a phone call or a message, it started with silence, the kind that feels intentional, like everyone involved is waiting to see what happens next before making another move. And for the first time since all of this began, I did not reach for my phone right away, I did not check for updates, I did not replay conversations in my head. I just sat there at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, staring at the folder still sitting where I left it, and I realized something had shifted again, not outside but inside me, because I was no longer reacting to what they were doing. I was waiting to see what would happen without me needing to push it forward. And that was new, that sense of stillness, that sense that things were already in motion without my involvement. And around mid-morning my phone finally rang, and this time the number was familiar in a different way. It was the same department that had called the day before, and when I answered, the voice on the other end was steady, professional, and direct, confirming my identity again before continuing, and he explained that they had completed an initial review of the account structure and transaction history, and that based on the information available, further action was being considered. And I listened carefully, not interrupting, not asking questions yet, just letting him explain the process, and he mentioned documentation, verification, and potential follow-up interviews, and when he said that last part, I felt that quiet clarity return again, because interviews meant statements, and statements meant consistency, and consistency was not something my father relied on. He relied on control, on tone, on authority, and none of that translated the same way when everything was being documented. And I asked one question when he paused, simple and direct, "What happens next?" And he answered without hesitation, "We will be contacting all involved parties again, and there may be a request for additional clarification in person." And I thanked him, kept my voice steady, and ended the call, and for a moment I just sat there letting that settle in, because this was the step that moved everything from inquiry to something more structured, something that could not be redirected with a single conversation or explanation. And about an hour later my phone buzzed again, but this time it was not a call, it was a message from Lily, short, almost abrupt. "They want Dad to come in." And I read it twice. Not because I did not understand it, but because of what it implied. This was no longer just about answering questions at the door. This was about stepping into a space where the conversation was not his to lead, and I could almost picture his reaction, the shift from controlled confidence to something more measured, more cautious, and I typed back one word, "Okay," because there was nothing else to say, and a few minutes later, another message came through, this one longer. "He is saying it is just a formality, that it will be cleared up quickly." And I stared at the screen for a moment, recognizing the pattern again, the same language, the same attempt to minimize what was happening, and I thought about responding, about explaining why it might not be that simple, but I stopped because that was not my role anymore. I had already done what I needed to do. and everything else was moving on its own, and I set my phone down, stood up, and walked over to the window, looking out at the street below, watching people move through their day like nothing had changed, and in that moment, I realized how separate my life had become from theirs, not just physically but structurally, because, for the first time, I was not adjusting to their decisions, I was watching them respond to something I had set in motion, and that shift felt quiet but undeniable. And later that afternoon my phone rang again, my father's name on the screen, and I let it ring for a few seconds before answering, and when I did, his voice was different again, not sharp, not urgent, but controlled in a way that felt rehearsed. "I am going in tomorrow," he said, no greeting, no explanation, just the statement, and I waited a second before responding, "I know." And there was a pause, not long but noticeable, like he was recalculating what to say next, and then he added, "This will be resolved." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was reassuring, but because it was consistent, the same certainty, just adjusted to fit the situation as it changed, and I said, "That depends," and I left it at that, because there was nothing more to add. And he did not respond immediately, and in that silence I could hear something unfamiliar, not just uncertainty but the absence of control, and I did not realize then that the next day when he walked into that building, everything he believed about how this would end was about to be tested in a way he had never experienced before. The next day did not feel like anything dramatic on the surface. There were no sudden messages, no urgent calls, just a quiet, steady progression of time, and yet everything about it carried a different weight, because I knew where my father was, I knew what he was walking into, and more importantly, I knew this was not a space he could control the way he controlled everything else, and around late morning my phone buzzed. Again, this time a message from Lily, shorter than usual. "He is there." And I read it once, then set my phone down without responding because there was nothing I needed to say, nothing I could change, and for the next hour, I moved through my apartment in a way that felt almost detached, making coffee I did not drink, opening my laptop without actually working, checking the time more often than I realized, because even though I was not there, I could feel the moment unfolding, and I kept thinking about how many times my father had sat across from someone and led the conversation exactly where he wanted it to go, how many times he had shaped outcomes with confidence alone, and I wondered what it looked like now, sitting in a room where every word mattered, where every statement was recorded, where explanation had to match evidence instead of replacing it, and just after noon my phone rang, and this time it was not Lily, not my mother, but my father, and I let it ring for a few seconds before answering, and when I did, there was no immediate greeting, just a brief silence on the line before he spoke, and his voice was different again, not sharp, not controlled in the same way, but measured, slower, like he was choosing each word carefully. "They asked a lot of questions," he said, and I did not respond right away because I wanted him to continue, and he did. About the account, about access, about when the withdrawals were made. And I could hear it in his tone, not confusion, not even frustration, but something more unfamiliar, something like recalibration, and I said, "That makes sense," keeping my voice neutral, and there was another pause before he added, "They have documentation," and that detail mattered because it confirmed what I already knew, that this was not a conversation built on interpretation, it was built on records, on timestamps, on signatures, and for the first time since all of this started, he did not try to reframe it, he did not try to minimize it, he just stated it, and I realized that something had shifted, not completely but enough to be noticeable, and he continued, "They said there may be follow-up," and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me, because that was the natural progression, the step after questions, and I said, "Okay," and I let that sit there because there was nothing else to add, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and in that silence I could feel the distance between where we had been and where we were now. Not just in this situation but in everything, and he finally said something I had not expected, something he had never said before in any form. "This is more serious than I thought." And I closed my eyes for a second when I heard that, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what had been building since the very beginning, the assumption that this would stay within certain limits, that it would not extend beyond his understanding of control, and I replied, "It always was." And there was another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not weak, not uncertain, but different. "Emily, we need to figure out how to move forward." And that sentence stood out more than anything else because it was the first time he was not trying to undo what had happened, not trying to reverse it, but acknowledging that something had changed, and I thought about responding, about explaining what moving forward might actually look like, but I stopped because this was not something I needed to define for him anymore, and I said, "That depends on what happens next," and I left it at that, and after we ended the call, I stood there in the quiet of my apartment again, the same space, the same stillness, but everything felt different, because this was no longer about starting something, it was about what had already begun unfolding in a way none of us could fully control, and I did not realize then that the next step would not come from a phone call or a message, but from a decision being made somewhere outside of both of us, one that would determine exactly how this story would end. It did not end with a single call or a single moment. It ended over the course of a few days, quietly, steadily, like something settling into place after being shaken for too long, and the final confirmation came in the form of another call from the same department, the same calm, measured voice on the other end, informing me that based on the documentation, the account structure, and the statements provided, the situation had been formally classified in a way that required resolution, not explanation, and while he did not use dramatic language, he did not need to because every word carried weight, and he explained that steps had been initiated to recover the funds through the appropriate channels, that the matter would continue through a formal process and that I would be contacted again with updates as they progressed, and I listened without interrupting, without asking questions, because for the first time since this began, I did not feel the need to push for anything more. It was already moving, already being handled in a way that did not depend on me repeating what had happened or proving why it mattered, and after I ended the call, I stood there in my apartment, the same space that had held every stage of this from the moment I saw that zero balance, and I realized how different everything felt now, not because the situation itself had completely resolved, but because the direction was no longer uncertain. And later that afternoon my father called again, and this time I answered immediately, not because I was expecting something new, but because I wanted to hear what he would say now that everything had moved beyond his control, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something else in it now. Something that had not been there before, not just caution but acknowledgement. They explained the process, he said, and I could hear the shift in how he was speaking, less about controlling the outcome, more about describing it, and I said, I know. And there was a pause before he continued, we are going to make arrangements to return the money, and that sentence landed differently than anything else he had said up to this point, because it was the first time he had moved from justification to action, from explaining why it happened to addressing what needed to be done, and I did not respond right away because I wanted to understand what that meant, not just in words but in reality, and he added, it will take some time but it will be handled. And I nodded slightly even though he could not see me because this was the first statement that aligned with what was actually happening, not a reframe, not a dismissal, but a response to the situation as it existed now, and I said, that is what should have happened from the beginning, and there was a longer pause this time, one that felt less like resistance and more like recognition, and when he spoke again his voice was quieter. I understand that now, and those words, simple as they were, carried more weight than anything else he had said, not because they fixed what happened, but because they marked a shift in how he was seeing it. And after we ended the call, I set my phone down and walked over to the window again, looking out at the same street, the same movement of people and cars, everything continuing as it always had, and I thought about the version of myself from a few days ago, sitting on the kitchen floor, staring at a number that had disappeared, trying to understand how something like that could happen, and I realized that the biggest change was not the money, not the process, not even the outcome, it was the fact that I had not accepted it, that I had not stayed silent, that I had allowed it to move beyond the boundaries they had always kept things within, and that shift, that decision was something they had never expected, and something I had never done before, and in the days that followed, the conversations became simpler, more direct, less about justification and more about resolution, and Lily reached out once more, her tone different now, more aware, more measured, and she said, I did not realize how it all connected. And I believed her because sometimes people only see the full picture when they are forced to step back and look at it from the outside, and I told her, now you do. And that was enough, because this was not about changing how they felt, it was about changing what was allowed to happen. And as everything continued to move forward, I found myself returning to that moment in the driveway, sitting in my car, deciding whether to walk back inside or drive away. And I understood something clearly now that I had not fully seen then. That night did not just start this process, it ended something else, the version of me that believed I had to accept what was given, what was taken, what was decided without me. And that realization stayed with me longer than anything else, because in the end what changed was not just the outcome of one situation, it was the line that had been drawn, the one that would not be crossed again. And I did not realize then that this was not just the end of that story, it was the beginning of something entirely different.